man?
Hey, how's it going, Dan?
Yeah. So, I kept trying to I think I overthought this one a lot, and
It's okay.
I kept trying to think about motivation and stuff and why the ball was falling, and got a little carried away probably. But, oh,
That's okay. I like it when people get carried away. Let's see. Nice. So we'll analyze this first and foremost from the perspective of bouncing ball.
Yeah.
But I do like the camera angle choice that you went with. And yeah, there's some nice nice ragdoll performance going on as well.
So I started out with just the ball. After I figured out what kind of angle and what the idea of the staging was going to be, I started out just doing a ball. And I guess you can't see it because the contrast, but it was with non-photo blue, so it kind of.
So you had basically this was your ball, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so you kind of have the ball go along this arc because obviously it's supported by the legs, so it's not
right.
Yeah.
There was this cat video a long time ago I remember seeing where this cat was trying to jump a 2-foot gap, and it just had thousands of years of instinct working against it because it was just so fat and just couldn't make it. It totally believed that it could make it, and it did everything it thought it was supposed to do to make that 2-foot gap, and it just fell straight down.
Something about animals just not realizing what they're not capable of. It's endlessly entertaining. I kind of have a similar note about spacing, or rather not spacing, timing here.
Yeah.
As Igor, I think these frames, these last, at least 2 drawings anyway, this could be on 1s instead of 2s. This could be on 1s instead of 2s. And I think that would give you a more effective, ramping out effect in time to kind of feel that hang time followed by poof, really sharp. So it's not changing the number of drawings, it's just changing the amount of time that they remain on.
Okay, sure.
And having this one on 2s is correct. So your brain can, imprint that image, or your eyes can imprint that image on your brain. And then this one on 1s probably. And then these hang time frames on 2s. Actually, if you go back, that could also be on 1s, since you've got enough hang time frames at the top of that arc. Yeah, and then, so you'd have basically 6 frames at the peak of it. 2, 4, 6. And then from there, probably back to 1s again.
Yeah.
Yep, because then your next impact frame occurs. That one's on 2s. Pop off into 1s. 1s. 2. 2. 1. 1. 2. 2. Actually, that could probably be on 1s. Okay. Overall, it's going to make the whole thing a little bit snappier.
Yeah.
And then, oh, I see. Kind of slows. Then this could be on 1s as he kind of peels over. And that's on 2s. I think for all this business, that timing stuff's going to make it feel a lot snappier, more physical, more satisfying on those impacts.
Sure.
For this beginning, I think we can talk a little bit about squash and stretch. These compression frames, I think you could get a little bit more of a sense of a compression in the body before.
More like a spring.
Yeah, like a spring off, and then that purple line of action would basically drop and straighten out like that.
Yeah.
And that's going to give you a really clear line to basically pull his rear end along as he launches. And then you keep the feet basically pinned in this pose.
Okay.
And then they would stretch out a lot more.
Oh yeah, sure.
Those hind legs. You could even like reverse the tail the other way.
Mm-hmm.
And then pull that.
Give it some rhythm and
give it some rhythm, pull it along that line of action. And I think you could spend less time in this.
Okay.
And more time kind of in here, like when he when he releases himself from the top of the bookshelf there.
Yeah. More like in the air instead of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then that would give you some leeway to kind of dramatize this over arc a little bit, like he's launching off and then hanging here, and then oh god, and then down it goes. I think once you get to this drawing, you're in the clear. So this drawing right before, you'd probably be out like a little bit further.
Sure.
Yeah, and the tail is a great device to kind of describe and exaggerate the line of action.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it stretches a little bit, but probably goes too fast to catch it.
Cool. And then from from a physicality standpoint, it might be fun to kind of like kick these legs back a little bit further, almost like they whiplash against the wall.
Yeah, sure. Little follow through.
Oh, yeah, more follow through on that. Yeah. And you could even like fold the belly over the chest a little bit more. So it's like a little bit more like he overshoots and then kind of folds in on himself.
Sure.
And that weight of the belly pushing down into the chest is what forces him to kind of, slide off against the wall there. I like the contrast of having an extension frame and then going straight to like that impact frame. That's like a really, that when it's sharply timed, that's like a really effective solution. And going from that flat 2-frame hold, you could exaggerate that a little bit more as well.
Sure.
So you're kind of going from like a flat circle to a stretched oval a little bit more, and then tracking each foot as it peels off from the ground. So you get a really smooth unfurling effect.
Sure.
And then that kind of gives you a nice opportunity to go back into like an inverted compressed shape.
Right.
And then as he does his little body roll over here, I think you could like drag the limbs over the body, tracking the point of each foot a little bit more laboriously, like they all just kind of follow a really clear and easy to track path of action.
Sure. Yeah, it's pretty rough.
The nice thing about tracking points is I think it makes it easier to draw in perspective sometimes, having a point to track. So like if you know this leg needs to kind of come here and roll over into that next pose, you kind of know, okay, on this breakdown, it means I have to foreshorten that.
Right. That's good.
It kind of makes
Makes sense.
it makes it easier to place things in perspective when you have to track it like that, especially flipping between drawings. And then as it comes around, I think you can have the cat like pancake out a little bit. So like once he's
like resting kind of.
Yeah, like once he's face down on his belly, you feel him like distribute outward a little bit more. So that from that perspective, you can feel that the weight is at rest.
Right.
And then the last note, I guess least relevant to the needs of this assignment would be the perspective on this bookshelf here.
Yeah.
If you want to see the top plane of that,
okay,
in order to be true to the camera angle that you've established, especially looking down on the floor here, which means that those drawings of the cat would basically be, we'd only
right.
see.
I was trying to do like a sort of like a really wacky fisheye, so that it would be like level with the top, but then you know. That's what I was going for, but it's kind of hard because there's no like we only have that front. We have no other side to sort of clue us into the dimensions of it.
I think if you wanted to do that, you with fisheye, when you can see the top and the bottom plane, or rather the looking up perspective and the looking down perspective.
Yeah.
You kind of need a distortion that goes this way.
Okay. Oh, sure.
So that, you can see the bottom of it this way. But then as you go up, obviously, it's like from here, we're looking down on the bookshelf.
Right.
But once we get up here, we're looking at the top plane of it.
Yep. Makes sense. Yeah, because it'll be around the center.
Yeah, it's
sort
like the
curl around the center.
The center, it would be like, I don't know, somewhere like right in there.
Right.
But for a one-off shot, like where you can see everything in the frame, it might be a more effective solution just to show like maybe a little bit of the top plane of that, at least.
Sure.
Even that alone, I think, like if you took all of your layers of the cat and like nudged them up, so you had some negative space there, and then just drew a little bit of the top plane of it. That to me is the solution that requires the least amount of work, just like nudging all those drawings up and then adding a top plane to that. It's the magic of 2D. You can just be like, and now you can see. That's that. Yeah, and you could probably just play with streamlining the perspective on some of that a little bit if you wanted to.
Yeah.
So that.
Right.
And then it might be a little more convincing if the window followed it.
Right. Yeah, this weekend I was just sort of obsessed with Maurice Noble's backgrounds.
Oh, they're great.
Yeah.
They're so great. Yeah, and Maurice Noble's stuff, he tends to, like when I think of his, he does a lot of great fisheye stuff like this as well. When I think of his stuff, like in fisheye, it's usually a pan, like that shot in The Grinch that he did where it's like panning up from Whoville and you can see
all
the little Whoville buildings down there, and you've got like the snow-capped hills.
Yeah.
And you pan up the mountain and it's like goes all the way up, but then you can actually see up into the Grinch's cave like that. But the camera, we're looking up at the Grinch right here, but down on the village here.
Yeah.
But the camera kind of does this.
Yeah.
Right. But because you're ending on this field guide and starting on this field guide, you don't really see the drawn distortion as much. I think seeing it all in one frame, that's when it kind of like becomes less convincing, seeing the whole thing at once. Because usually that effect comes from like if you're using your iPhone and you're doing like a pano,
Right.
It's like distorted one way in this direction and then another way in the other direction.
Right.
And you're standing right here. Like that tends to be what causes a fisheye. And when you see fisheye all in one frame, it's kind of like that. like Deuce Bigelow, male gigolo, peering through the little keyhole, where it's like you just see Rob Schneider's big stupid face peeking in, and then you see. I don't know why I'm thinking of Deuce Bigelow. Like, hey guys, remember that movie from 17 years ago? But yeah, this is a really great assignment. I think it's a good use of the bouncing ball. Just mostly cleaning up some of the arcs, some of the drawing, and sharpening the timing a bit. I think would get you a more effective version of what you've already got here. But
cool.
Yeah, really excellent work, man.
Thank you.
Did you have any questions or?
I think we covered a lot. It was good. I'm trying to think of anything. I think that was good. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I might have some more later.
So this is the first week 1 assignment is just a breaking the ice kind of thing. But I mean, if you have a more fleshed out assignment like this, I mean, this would be a great candidate even for the final assignment, pantomime. So you're probably going to be working at a more advanced level of detail in your assignments than maybe some people want to do in the class, which is fine. But I think because this is a nice little test on its own, it might be worth revisiting, some of the notes from tonight and having it
totally
in your portfolio. Because, it's nice. It would be even a really nice candidate for, like, finishing the whole background. If you're, like, inspired by Maurice Noble and you want to get, like, a nice-looking scene on your reel or portfolio, like, it'd be cool to, like, just finish the image and finish the assignment, It's a it's a nice little test. You could play with just, like, getting a really clean composition on everything. And
originally I was going to have the cat hit the bird stand, and then it was going to, like, knock, and then the bird cage was going to fall on his head.
If you wanted to get more, narratively dramatic with it, it might be fun to draw the bird cage, like, just out of his reach.
Right, right.
And the bird is just kind of chilling out, like, darting its head back and forth right there. So the cat, like, just misses it, And so there's a little bit more at stake in the story.
Right.
More of a close call.
The bird is all nonplussed because
and then you can even do, like, that Chuck Jones thing of, like the cat is, like, looking down with that sneaky expression,
right?
And you kind of have that, like, I'm gonna eat you. I don't know, like the way Chuck Jones draws that expression,
right?
Just like, and it's just like, I'm gonna eat you. Yeah, and then here you could even have, like, the mouth open if you wanted.
Still expecting to reach. Yeah.
Still, like, for that one frame, still believes that he's going to get it. Here it's like, it goes from that to, like, panic over one frame, but it's still basically the same
right
open mouth expression, but the eyes go from belief to, oh shit. Cool. Yeah, great work, man.
Cool. Thanks, man.
Of course. So we'll see you next week. Well,
yeah,
we'll have the lecture later tonight, so if people have questions,
I'll stick around.
Yeah, I'll say goodbye to you guys later tonight.
I've got a quick question if I could interject.
Yeah, of course.
When you're going through and going, like, okay, this would be potentially better on ones, better on twos, is that something you would typically do, like, on the X sheet or just, like, on a physical arc before you actually got any drawings done? Or is that something you typically refine after, like, a first pass of drawings?
So it kind of depends on experience coming from intuition. When I was at Disney, I would talk to Eric Goldberg about how he would plan his shots, and he even plays with stuff after he's X sheeted out. And he's a pretty thorough, like, wants to plan out everything in advance on his X sheet, like on frame, 14, he's like, I'm going to have this pose on frame 24, I'm going to have this pose, and he'll write like a little description of what he wants to happen based on, his timing. But even from there, he'll flip it or do a test of it and watch it play back at speed and realize, oh, you know what, maybe this would be better if it landed on frame 25 instead of 24, and then I'll add like one more in between in there. Or like, oh, I thought I was only going to have, a halfway breakdown and then one ease in, but I need 2 ease ins. And, watching it felt a little fast. So instead of this being on 1s, I'm going to have this be on 2s. I think there should be a reactionary component to things where like you'll never get it all right the first time. Even like the most experienced animators will see something and say, oh, that would feel better if it was just a little snappier. I think one thing you can control is your spacing, like whether you're doing it faster or slower, the spacing should still probably be something that resembles this, but whether you do like the slow version of that or the fast version of that, either way, like your spacing should be physically convincing. And that's kind of where the difference between timing and spacing comes into play again. Whether this happens over 5 drawings or, 8 drawings, or rather 8 frames, 5 frames, all of them being on 1s, or 8 frames where it's like, okay, the first, 3 are on 1s, or the first 2 are on 1s, and then the next 3 are on 2s, what have you, But yeah, I think it's just keeping an open mind to shifting things 1 or 2 frames here and there to get a more impactful effect is usually how it ends up going for most of us. And in CG, obviously, it's very easy, but in 2D, it's easy as well. It's like, oh, I'll just like keep that on screen for 1 more frame. The thing that's nice about 2D is that having stuff on 1 and 2s is very forgiving. In CG, there are little to no production environments where they don't want everything on 1s. So the graph editor is basically just like a really polished version of good 2D spacing. But in 2D, there's like a nice textural effect to things ramping in and out of different speeds for more of like a punchiness. Like the best anime out there, I feel, takes advantage of that really well. You look at like the Studio Ghibli stuff, and like really measured, calm scenes are like on 4s, and it just keeps things feeling really subtle and like low energy when they need to be. And then when suddenly things like go balls out action and things are like snapping around on 1s and there's like effects everywhere, and then there's like a pause and the character will like go into a hold, there's like a really impactful feeling about that. It's like it's like the difference between a painting and a photograph. A painting is like giving you the impression or the feeling of something, and a photograph is representing it. And I feel like with CG animation, we're trying harder to represent motion, and in 2D, you're trying harder to like abbreviate it and summon the feeling of it. And that's what's so much fun about 2D, I think, is that you can play with timing and what images linger on screen and how they linger on screen. And it's not that you aren't doing that in CG as well, but you can aim for a different textural effect, which is really cool. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely.
Timing feels like the most mysterious thing to me. Like, and like in this, so I do this on paper. So this is like my guess of timing. I think I held 1 of the frames, but pretty much. I don't know. I feel like it's just like, I don't know, man.
The thing that's nice, so the consolation I think with timing is there are many different timings that can work. Like you can hold an anticipation for 6 more frames, and maybe that'll give you a certain effect. But I think the harder thing to master well is spacing, just because of like the timing issue, where you can just rearrange how long something lingers. You can play with that at little to no expense, but if the spacing from one drawing to the next isn't right, it kind of doesn't matter how you time it, because it just won't look convincing going from this pose to that pose. So timing is hard, though, in the way that comedy is hard, or the way that writing is hard, or the way that music is difficult to compose, where you're going to get a different effect if, the amount of time between the notes in the Jaws theme, right? Like that downbeat between the notes that John Williams uses to, describe the shark. Those two notes side by side with no pause is a totally different thing. But with the pause, da 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 da, it's like, oh, that's the theme. It's the theme because of the downbeat in the timing, and that's very often what timing is. It's like creating a different feeling based on the relationship between now and now versus now and now. It's kind of like a form of communication almost, and the drawings with good spacing in the drawing is like the vessel to that communication, because people can only take things in at the rate that you show it to them, which is kind of the fun of it. It's like if you're giving a speech and you pause dramatically for effect before you deliver the next piece of information in your speech. Timing is communication, and that's what's liberating about it. You can communicate it kind of however you want. And then there's like a more technical way of approaching timing, where it's like, I want this to feel heavier, or I want this to feel lighter and snappier. Sometimes you need more time for something to resolve. If it's heavier, like, okay, more ease-in frames on twos as this giant, boulder rolls to a stop. Or it's a little ping pong ball, so it's going to like tremble and roll really quickly across the screen on ones. So you kind of can employ timing in a really ultra technical sense, or in kind of a more spontaneous kind of jazz music sense, where you're using it to kind of play with how much information you're sharing at a given moment. Cool. I really like this one too. So that one I feel like has an interesting set of ratios at work. Like I like all the ones that you mentioned too. The thing I like about this one is it's easy to break down. So if you've got to draw him over and over again, I feel like you've got a pretty clear, like, upside down egg or honeybee head shape to sort of build off of. And then you can start saying, okay, what are my golden ratios that kind of help me track where to place things on the face? If I draw a line here, that's roughly creating a hemisphere within that egg. That helps me spot the bottom edge of the eyes. So whenever I'm designing a character and I find a drawing, the first pass is usually the intuition pass, right? Like what comes naturally. You kind of reveal your own instincts, your own sense of appeal, your own predispositions towards what kind of character you want to draw and how you want it to look. And then once you have enough of a body of poses or images to draw from, then you can start putting on your analytical hat and like breaking it down and sort of assessing what you can do to recreate it and have like a system that works for you. So it kind of becomes second nature to build it on the fly when you're animating it. So I look for the most critical designs first, like the overall silhouette, which is like this upside down egg. Then I find like the halfway mark as like a tracker. Or if I had a character, for instance, with like a long kind of rectangular Frankenstein head like this, and I knew it was like a flat-browed character with eyes way up here, then I kind of have to say, okay, what's the subdivision for that? Is that like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? So I have like basically 1/5 of the head is roughly where that marker would happen. So then I would find the halfway point roughly about there, and then work my way up to about like 2/5, 1/5. Those are all just, it's not always that scientific. Like every drawing isn't like an architectural design, but it does help with just intuiting that stuff as you kind of draw it over and over again. So getting back to your character, then I kind of find a general size of the nose. Like, okay, so here I've got the bridge of the nose starting roughly at maybe about 3/4 of the way up the eye. So I'll start that line about there. And then even though I'm only indicating the shape of the nose with this one line, just to kind of keep it, because I don't want to draw like a big Muppet nose on his face, right? I still basically figure out what the Muppet version of it is, because it helps me control the volume of that shape. And this is the most important part I want to work out or figure out. Like, okay, I've got this thing that covers basically maybe a little over a third of his face, not quite half, but about a third. But it starts at the top of the eye and ends with about maybe 1/5 of his face width left at the bottom, and that's where I occupy my mouth. The mouth is, you've got it generally corner to corner with like a little bit of real estate, maybe like 3 or 4 line widths of real estate before the mouth corner becomes the chin. And that's something that, like, the mouth is a pretty, transformative shape within the face. So the width of it, you can kind of vary, based on expression. But then, like, the height of it, I would then start involving the jaw. So if I was drawing like 2 poses side by side of the same character, like maybe one pose, his brows are down, and he's kind of like, he hears the word science, and he's like, who called? And then in the next expression, he realizes that it's an emergency and that he has to go, save the planet. And so his brows shoot up. And again, like, that's not going to change the height of its head. The brows going up is more like the skin riding across the scalp. So these are going to come up. The skull mass is going to stay the same, but you're going to develop, creases on the forehead. So maybe just adding like 1 line above it or so would help. And then the eyes, I would start the base of them at roughly the same spot, but then maybe just kind of like extend them vertically a little bit. Like they're open wider and like the lids are pulling up, revealing a little bit more of the eyeball itself. And then if we wanted to do an open mouth expression, I basically start with understanding that, the jaw here is almost closed. It's basically a nearly closed jaw with relaxed lips and tense mouth corners. But if I wanted to get the mouth wide open, I would rough in basically the default head and then draw the mouth expression that I want. Maybe show the teeth, maybe the tongue, maybe a little bit of the upper teeth there. And then from there, extend the jaw outward to support that expression. So you're kind of like simulating the jaw rotating out and opening up the height of that overall silhouette. And the nose, there's generally connectivity between the nasolabials right here and the mouth corners. If you filled that line in, he would become like an old Hanna-Barbera character or Jim Cricket or something. But that helps you establish pliability in the face that connects the features. So if you sketch in, something like this, keep the nose bridge at the top the same, because underneath that's basically where the skull, defines a ridge where skin wraps over the bone and then it becomes cartilage the rest of the way. So you want to keep the eye socket region relatively solid unless it's the eyebrows, pulling back the skin on the forehead. But then once you get to the lower part of the nose, you kind of work from solid up here and then pliable, almost like a gradient of pliability from the top down where it becomes more malleable. So I'm going to define that main shape, but if I were animating this, I would draw these nostrils a little bit higher in the neutral, and then when he opens his mouth, like those would come down a little bit. They would kind of squash and stretch, going in this direction. So you're just able to relate those 2 images back to back to control that, right? So that's kind of how I organize the maintenance of my shapes. And then when I'm cleaning it up or tying it down, I say I want to define this shape with this line only, maybe draw a little bit of this lower part, and then end it right here with the other side of the nose. And because I'm just going from one pose to another here, I'll do the same thing. Just keep that one line there when I'm cleaning it up. And then for other components, right? Like I like here how you've got his ears basically following this line of action. So what you can do then is just kind of work inside of that main shape, find a starting point. Generally the ears begin right around where the nasolabial starts, right about here. So it's not like a absolute thing, but it helps. So in a pose like this, I would say you could probably raise the ear a little bit. You don't have to. I mean, obviously, you can do whatever you want. Like if the character design is making a certain statement, you can put the ears way down there. But if I was going to make a design choice like that, I would probably very subtly adjust this so that at least there's some kind of connectivity. Because there's certain things with anatomy where certain things line up. And, you know, even though everyone's got different features and a different balance of features on their face, you know, unique to themselves, it's still good to like at least find areas where implied lines flow and connect. And then the viewer will just kind of attribute their own sense of authenticity to it because it feels connected. And then kind of similarly, looking at what you've got here in your profile, this is pretty successful because you've got the cranium flowing down into this occipital region right here before it becomes the spine. And then you're kind of just creating a fluid line coming off the neck where the back of his hair meets it. And that kind of gives you that fluid silhouette right there. And so looking at that profile and the fact that you've identified that as one that really feels like the character to you, I would look at that and say, okay, what can I take from that? And when I see that and compare it to this one, I notice two things. Here, the nose comes out a little further and hooks down, and the cranium comes out a little bit. So you're getting a little bit more of this bird-like profile here. And here, if I were to turn this, I would see that as kind of like maybe a shallower nose and like a shallower cranium. So turning this one to the side, I think you'd get something a little bit more, like assuming this as a constant, right? And the only variable is we're rotating it. I think you'd get something a little bit more like this. And comparing it and contrasting it, if you prefer the depth of this, then I think a few questions have to be sort of addressed, like, okay, up here, his chin comes out a little bit further, so what does that do to this drawing? Or his nose hooks out a little bit deeper there, what does that do to this part of the drawing? Or like his cranium kind of flows out and then tapers back up. What does that do here? I probably have to go out a little bit deeper. So there's just a few things that become slightly adjusted in accordance with like the values of turning something in space authentically. And it's the most difficult thing I think about 2D animation. I mean, acting is hard, but I think controlling the form so that it's not a distracting component is also hard. But generally the order of change is not too big. I think you've got enough there where it's only just kind of extending him out a bit. And this is why it's kind of like you want to identify the drawing that most successfully captures your intentions. And then you can say, okay, here's my constant. Now, what variables do I adjust to kind of like stay true to this constant? Let's see. Hair feels good. And hair's a little bit more of like a fluid thing, you know, because it's so not solid in its behavior, unless, you know, he's got a lot of product in it or something. But yeah, there's a few things that, oh, and I'll bring that ear back up to stay consistent with both the other drawing and so I think on something like this, it's just bringing some of that three-dimensionality back that was present in the profile, and I think the rest of it is pretty successful. I like that he's got a mole on his face. It's like a defining feature just to kind of create a landmark, and it looks like the mole, you're kind of tracking it, or the black hole rather, you're kind of tracking it placed based on the nasolabials. So you've got about it's about 2 nasolabial widths away from, at least in this drawing. So now you could say, if this is my constant, how far away should it be here? Right, so maybe in this drawing, 1, 2, bring it in just a little bit. Again, that's just assuming that this is your constant now. And it's okay to cheat things to camera too. Like for instance, if you want to get a cuddlier looking vibe from him by bringing out some of this cheek, I think it's okay to do that, as long as the more rigid parts of your character, like the cranium, the back of the skull, the more rigid aspects of the nose, like if you're able to kind of keep those constant in perspective, it becomes more affordable to cheat some of the doughier aspects of the character, like, you know, bringing an eye out to stage it for like an appealing and clear expression, or like bringing a cheek out a little bit just to kind of give you like a more like, I don't know, like friendly looking expression. There's certain things, like it's 2D, right? You can draw it the way you want it. And I think one of the joys about 2D is you kind of have to, it's sort of like good storytelling, right? Like you can make something up and the audience will come with you if you ground certain aspects of it, you know, within a certain degree of legitimacy or reality. It's like the best fantasy is generally grounded enough in terms of like you understand the rules, you understand the intentions, you understand the logistics, so that if you start introducing like dragons and magic into it, everything else is grounded enough that you're like willing to buy into the fantasy or buy into the illusion. And I think a lot of the best Disney animation functions on that principle of grounding enough things in solidity so that when you start making stuff up or cheating, it's sort of veiled within that solidity and that foundation knowledge that you're building it upon. You know, you look at a lot of Glenn Keane drawings and he's breaking the anatomy or dislocating a shoulder or pulling things out to stage it in a 3/4 profile for maximum clarity and effect, but it's kind of pushing the limits of what that figure drawing pose in real life would be able to achieve. But I think that's sort of the charm of it. There's like, the lie is like layered on top of the authenticity. We don't have to call it a lie, that sounds harsh. Illusion. Cool. So that's kind of, any questions about that? Is that pretty straightforward? It's kind of, we just kind of basically covered, you know, construction and just like managing shapes as they turn. We can talk a little bit now about line of action. So if you're going to use this character for a walk cycle, I think one thing to help you manage that long, lanky profile is just rough out the stick figure version of it. I mean, he's already a pretty thin guy to begin with, but when I'm blocking a walk, I generally start with something that feels like this, where it's like, okay, I know his hips are right here. It's sort of like, you know, we all took, most of us anyway, I'm sure, took figure drawing classes in college, and a lot of us are coached to like draw the line of action first, right? Like if you've got a character, you know, in a pose, like maybe it's a guy, you know, with his arm back and he's like perched up on a rock and he's like got his hand over his forehead and he's like looking out in the distance, like hark, who goes there? You know, it's you just generally want to start with a line and then start kind of hatching in the basic shapes and the basic center of gravity that's going to describe your attitude or your pose. And I find it easiest to work really broad like that before I start, you know, going in there and like, okay, his arm goes here and his sleeves go there and his hand is this big, so I got to draw every finger now. Like, it's easy to get caught up in that way too soon before you've even figured out your ratios and your general, you know, thrust of energy or line of action. So working out a guy like this, I would probably do all my keys first and track things like the length of his elbow to his shoulder, or like the length of his waist to his knee, or like the length of his ankle to the tip of his toe. All the stuff that's going to really make it easy for me to, not easy, but straightforward for me to then architect, details like his belt, his tie, his sleeve edges, his loose tie, all the stuff that's basically ornamental relative to the skeletal construct of the pose. So then from there, I still try to keep in mind my ratios. So if I measure his head, as about that much, I'd say, okay, he's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's say roughly 5.5, maybe 6 to make it easier. Head lengths tall, before we 5.5, 6.5 if you include his head. But if you wanted to make it easier, you could say he's 6 head lengths tall plus a head. But I think it's good to work that stuff out for yourself because it kind of at least helps you eyeball it. We could look at this one where he's in color. And I think it's good not to be too precise about it because, a lot of times when you're animating, you're going to be working freehand or longhand and you don't want to be too insanely fussy accurate about it, but you want to make sure that if you can just roughly mock it up. Yeah, so we would say including his head, he's probably about 7 heads tall. I think that's a good way to at least know if you're kind of in the right wheelhouse. If he starts to feel taller or shorter, just kind of do a little sketch marquee and you could, if he's in a pose like this or he's in a pose like this where his knees are bent, and he's looking down like this at the ground and his body's curved, you could still kind of eyeball it okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and be all right, that's roughly correct. It's just good to check it. At Disney, I think they would say they're human characters like Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast were 4 or 5 heads tall. They're a little bit more all their characters look like they're about 5'7", like movie star height because they have bigger heads, And I think because you're going for a more exaggerated height, it's kind of got to be on the smaller end. Like Roger from Dalmatians or George from Paperman, these really lanky Disney characters where they're exaggerating it in the other direction to make a statement out of it. And I think an extreme example would be Jack Skellington, who's probably 15 heads tall. He's got that tiny little head, triangle body, and the rest of him is just and that's basically animating a stick figure with a triangle on top of it, right? So that makes it pretty manageable, and even the hands are basically stick figure hands. He's got that that spider collar, so that kind of makes it easy to deal with. The feet are basically just little ornamental nubs at the bottom, so that makes it easy. I think a lot of Tim Burton sketches they're really pushed in terms of the length and amplitude of the shapes, but they're kind of easy to construct from a graphic standpoint. I think there's a really appealing utility to his designs that makes them enticing to draw or enticing to recreate. So yeah, for this guy, I think also, even though you're kind of going for this very geometric, very made out of tapered rectangles kind of approach, I think it's still good to keep some sense of rhythm and fluidity in there because it will make it easier to kind of hang the frame over the gesture, so to speak. So even something like this is nice because you've got a little bit of an S curve running through it. This leg is out a little bit further. It's a bit of the classic contrapposto where the weight is on this leg. So the hips are a little off to the side, but then the body is countering it a little bit because he's got this shoulder out. From a pose standpoint, I think it's nice whenever you've got a different joint to kind of introduce a little bit of a break. So right here you've got the fingertip flowing in a straight line all the way to the elbow, which is really nice. It's like a simple line of action. But I think it's also nice to introduce some anatomy into that. So you can have this, fingertip to elbow be your main line of action. But then on top of that, you pull the wrist up a little bit and then get like a little bit of a break in that flow, so that it's just reminding the viewer that like there is some construction and anatomy present in the design. Unless you're going for like the Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs thing where everyone's kind of made out of like a curvy sausage, in which you could almost draw the anatomical version first and then layer in the curvy sausage version on top of it, which sometimes actually does help when you're trying to legitimize that kind of a design. It's almost like like in CG, you'd say, I turned on the Benbows, brought it out. Because there's a lot of CG rigs where you pose it like this first, and then you grab the control here and here and push them out so that you get something kind of like this on the puppet. That's like kind of the standard CG animation way of getting a cartoony pose like that, but I think it's helpful to think that way when you're drawing it too, just from like a construction standpoint, knowing where the joint would be, so that when you're caricaturing it, there's like a sense of authenticity to the decision. Did you have any questions, or is that did I leave anything out in terms of something you'd want to know when you're building your character for a pose?
No, this is really helpful. Because, just construction-wise, that's really helpful. And I think my main concern with him was making sure that he's not too stiff when I go to do the walk cycle and stuff like that. And I think that's helpful to think about it, like with the line of action and sort of a gesture drawing approach.
I think the thing that helps me is, especially when I'm defining a walk, is when I start with something like this, and then if I'm like, let's say for instance I wanted a pose where he's like leaning down and then he kind of leans down a bit further, to kind of like he lifts the thing up and then he leans down a bit further to peek under it. I act it out a few times and get a sense of what the actual physicality of that is. If I lean down further, my head and chest are going to come lower, my elbow and shoulder are going to counter that, and my rear end is probably going to counter that a little bit. But then this hand right here, which is supporting the weight, is going to be met with more resistance and bend a little bit. So then I would say, okay, my first line of action is basically this. And then on a separate layer, separate color, I might do the inverse where, okay, this is going to come a little bit lower. The head's going to peek under. This shoulder is going to pull back. So this hand will come up, which will force this elbow back, which will force the shoulder up. That's going to force the chest to twist a little bit. As this twists and comes down, that's going to push this elbow out. That elbow pushing out is going to put pressure on the wrist, which is going to cause those fingers to come up. So you kind of have resistance right off the bat and understanding when forces are opposing or when forces are kind of going with the main line of action. The ankles would probably come up, put more pressure on the knees, and the rear end would come up very slightly, probably. So it's just finding those subtle changes first makes it a lot easier to then construct the pose on top, because then I would tie down this drawing first to a level of detail roughly matching the model sheet, and then flipping between, I would know how little I need to change that drawing going into this pose. So I wouldn't tie it down immediately. I would still get more drawings around the shot or around that moment first, but when you get the gesture drawings in your breakdowns and keys working pretty consistently with each other in terms of how much it's going to move here, how far it's going to move here, what mechanics are going to bend or stretch, or adjust, then it's like tying down becomes a matter of, I need to tie down the most important storytelling drawing and then jump to the other ones and relate those back to this one. And the gesture drawing is already there to kind of help you find how much that relationship will change, or if it will just be kind of a trace over nudged very slightly. So yeah, having a system, I think, like aiming for the goal as soon as possible, the goal being like the storytelling pose and what changes to tell the story. And then, yeah, just like, again, like hanging the ornamentation of your character design on top of it. It becomes more of like solving a math problem and less of like this nebulous thing of like, where do I put it? How do I draw it? Versus having like the goal kind of achieved very early before you start hanging the other stuff on top. It's sort of like you watch a lot of the old like silly symphonies from the 1930s where the final image on the screen is like a third generation trace over. You know, it went from like rough to like tie down to like somebody cleaned it up and then somebody took the cleanup drawing and inked it onto a cell and the lines are all wiggly. And it's probably like by that point pretty removed from that original animated drawing, but because all those choices were made, a lot of old-fashioned animation kind of is wiggly and solid at the same time because there were really good foundational choices underneath it, but by the time it got traced, it was like a third-generation image put up on the screen. So that's kind of why a lot of that old classic Disney animation feels really well figured out and messy at the same time. But I think that's a good lesson to learn, is that even though that third generation image is maybe a little bit wiggly or a little bit messy, it still is capturing that good decision making happening underneath. So yeah, it kind of protects you up front from a lack of clarity or maybe something not turning out as clean as you would like it to. Cool. All right. Let me save this out, and I will. Is Photoshop okay? I can save the.
Yep, that's fine.
Cool. So I'll just call it. Actually, 2 notes. Cool. So I'll drop these Photoshop files for you guys on the server following class. Cool. Any other questions, Ashley?
No, that's great. Thank you.